filing nominations for Professor of the Year, Course of the Year, all the streams of the year, Best TA of the Year. Juliet's in the room, just an idea. And among other candidates, I mean, yeah, these people are super worthy of the awards, and we obviously want to hear your voice about who should be receiving them. That being said, the PSSA elections, voting actually ends tomorrow at 5 p.m. There are a bunch of candidates in this room, I won't name for the sake of just being neutral, but that is super important for you guys to vote for as well. So just make sure you're voting for the Prof Awards as well as the PSSA exec for next year, and take it away, Professor.
All right, so yes, thanks again for coming, and yes, I did just approach Sean and say, we should do something, and I had this crazy idea that I've had arguing with other people about Star Wars, and so now we can have an argument at the end of this. And in fact, maybe what you should be doing, so whoever the future PSSA executive is having something like dinner and a movie with professors next year. I'm sure others have crazy ideas about things in movies that they've seen or vice versa. So this is, as it says up there, why the politics in Star Wars is confused. So the place to start is, what do I mean by, well, we'll see if this is going to work. What do I mean by confused? Why is this politics in Star Wars messed up? Hopefully I'm not going to have to push that button every time I do one of these, but if you've seen, and I'm primarily going to focus on the original Star Wars movie. It's very old, I know. Actually, it was the first date I went on. That's how old it was. First formal date where you drive like a long way to go to a very fancy theater and see this amazing movie, which is how we all viewed the special effects in those days. I know you don't feel that way, but okay. This is not going to work. All right. So, first thing to think about. Classic American movie is, oddly enough, the Alfred Hitchcock kind of movies, where something happens and some poor individual is swept up into events beyond their control, and they have to rise to meet the challenge. It is the average Joe gets pushed into an extraordinary situation and deals with it. This is not exactly the story of Luke Skywalker, right? Luke Skywalker is some poor guy stuck in the middle of nowhere. It sounds like it's going to be this classic American story. He's there, it says peasant because, he's out. I don't even know what he's supposed to be farming in this godforsaken spot. There's references to something like mushrooms in this, and you're thinking, really? I don't. But it turns out that he's actually not just anybody, right? He's got some kind of destiny before him that is told by his past, and this has all been explained in the later movies, etc. So, first question is sort of, who is this character? Where does he come from? It's not your basic story. Second thing is, which we also find out, yes, I'm going to be coming over here and doing this. Princess Leia. So, it turns out that there's a princess in this story. So again, not a very American kind of plot here to have royalty involved in the story. And then you find out that Luke and Leia are brother and sister later on. And so, so basically Luke is a prince, but in hiding. What's going on here? More complicated things are when you start to, I don't know if I'm doing this in the wrong order. I'm going to have to get trained here. When you find out more about their story, right?
And I'm going to push the button.
I'm going to give hand signals to someone to push the button.
Which button is it?
It's the auto. I wish. When you find out the story of Luke and Leia and so forth, you go back to Padme. And then you've got this really confusing bit of things about she's a queen. Oh, but that's elected. I'm sorry. Who elects a queen? You call them something else. Then she's appointed senator. Okay, I get the appointing queens, but then you elect senators. This is all just kind of reversed. I don't know. There's more stuff there, which is in those, I don't know how we call these, the later prequels, whatever, where there's stuff about the emperor and the Senate. And okay, that's hearkening back to something that's more recognizable about either the Roman Republic turning into an empire or Athens. That part you can get, but there's just sort of confusing things about who these people are, where they're coming from. There's stories, there's roles, thank you, for the droids in this, and very purposefully in some of the first movies. But in the later movies, they're treated more like they're beings of some kind that have rights and roles and all that. Not so much in the early movies. You know, how does that fit into the story? Are they slaves? Are they not? And then ultimately, the question you have to ask is, you know, Luke, Leia, these are not your normal Joes that rose to the equation, up to the standards of the situation. They're people who are there because they have some kind of hereditary link. So there's a lot of allusions here, obviously, to royalty, aristocracy, and so forth. So where does this all come from? And what I'm going to argue is a little bit that follows what you would find on the internet and some stuff that doesn't. So I'm going to, you know, go with some things that you would find if you spent 5 seconds Googling or on YouTube, which is obviously when George Lucas made the movie, he was influenced by other things. And there's a lot of stories about how Lucas and some of the other people in his generation were American filmmakers, but they were really the first ones that had gone to film school and had studied lots of foreign film. And it's these foreign films that are influencing the films that they make, influencing on different levels. And so there's a lot of stuff on the internet about Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, which is a movie about, a number of things that you would see as both visual parts of the original Star Wars, but also as part of the storyline. So you can't really see it very well in this picture, but the thing that made this movie different and something that Lucas liked was it's built around these two characters who are basically servants or slaves. They are trying to just escape and get away from things, and they keep getting swept up into events. And Lucas liked the idea that you could tell this story from the perspective of not the top class, not the middle class, but the people who are really at the bottom. And so it's these two slaves who are running away. They get swept up into a war. They try to escape. They wind up meeting a hidden princess. So you can follow some of the storyline here when you think about the Star Wars here in a minute. And they have to take this princess someplace. There's other stuff that's in this movie that's not in the original Star Wars, but it's pretty clear that you could follow one part of the storyline in the original Star Wars movie from Hidden Fortress. And there's a lot of things that are visually taken from this Akira Kurosawa movie and put in to Star Wars. And there are some scenes at the beginning where it's these two arguing. They are different as far as their outlook and attitudes, but also how they sound and so forth. It's very close to what you see with the droids in the original Star Wars movie. There's a couple of scenes that are also very close from this movie in the original Star Wars. There's a bit where there's fighting going on. It's actually part of a jailbreak in the Hidden Fortress story. And these two are basically just trying to, you know, get through the fighting and get out. And there's fighting going back and forth. It's very much like the scene with the droids sort of walking through while there's a blaster battle going on and so forth. And of course, as I said, there's similarities here with the notion that they are there. They've got to rescue this hidden princess so she can go do whatever it is she has to go do. So there's a lot of people who have looked at that, the similarities, especially in the film shots, and said, oh, this is the most important influence on this original Star Wars movie. And I'm going to say only partly. There's a little bit that is similar, and that one storyline, the storyline of the droids and a little bit about Princess Leia is from Hidden Fortress. There's more about Luke and his relationship with Obi-Wan Kenobi that you should all recognize as a different story, right? Boy of destiny who needs to become some future leader, who's got to have a wizard that helps train him, and so forth. You've all heard this a bunch of times, right? in the legend of Arthur, and in fact in a number of different stories. And there's another really important influence on the Star Wars stories, which is from an academic, Joseph Campbell, who wrote really fascinating work a long time ago, in the 40s, I think, about storylines from different cultures. He studied all kinds of different cultures and found that in all these different places you could find very similar stories about a hero and the path that the hero has to take and how they get rejected and then come back and do all these various things. And you would find this kind of story, like the Arthur story, in many different cultures. And so Lucas very consciously had studied some of that and brought that into his film writing. So there's some of that. Is there a movie influence here? Earlier movie that shaped this? I'm going to say no, but you could think about a Disney movie. So, if you know the Sword and the Stone Disney movie, there actually are a couple of scenes that are quite similar to scenes in the original Star Wars. So, animated Disney movie about Arthur as a boy meeting Merlin, who's going to train him and so forth. There's a bunch of time in that movie where those two spend time with, it's actually a father and son here, but a few of the lines that happen. There's one scene in The Sword and the Stone where the boy has to do, so young Arthur has to do the dishes. The wizard helps him and teaches him how to, or at least starts to use magic to wash the dishes. They go out of control. There's a confrontation then between the wizard and the father knight here. And what happens is the father winds up walking away and he says some things about the boy. You know, you should not listen to this old wizard. It's all hocus pocus, whatever. It's very similar to what Han Solo says in the original Star Wars movie to Luke. Similar kind of setup, in fact, with Luke practicing and then the guy walking away. Okay, no politics in here to speak of. We can ignore the Disney connection. If you want to think about the Hidden Fortress connection, then the thing that's interesting there was Kurosawa made the movie about a very hierarchical society, and the purpose was to be looking from the bottom up. It doesn't work unless you've got that hierarchy. So the fact that Lucas is borrowing that means he also is borrowing some sense of this division or hierarchy in the social scene and in the various characters. None of this is really what I wanted to talk to you about, though. So the Legend of Arthur bit and the Hidden Fortress connection, like I said, that's stuff that you can find online easily enough. And particularly because film students see the visual connection and they see a little bit of the storyline as well. So I want to tell you about a connection to a different movie, which also people note online, though they don't often make as many of the connections as far as the visual look of the original Star Wars movie as they could. Like I said, if you look up Hidden Fortress and Star Wars, you'll find a number of videos that are actually pretty good about the similar shots, etc. So here's some cuts from this other movie I want to tell you about and comparing them to the look of the original Star Wars. So here's Luke looking cool, wherever it is in the middle of the desert by himself with no girls around. And here's our peasants that we're going to compare to. And you can look at how the boots are and the clothing, similar in certain ways. Here's one of the cities, I don't know if you can call them cities, towns in the original Star Wars movie. And here's what one of the towns or cities looks like in the movie I'm going to tell you about, and you can see the domes and the multiple sort of different level domes together. That's how all these cities look in both movies. Here's Obi-Wan Kenobi in the sort of traditional Star Wars garb. Here's someone dressed rather similarly in this other movie. You can see the belt with the sword hanging down, the same kind of dark cape over the white clothing, even the same kind of lapels and things. We know who he is, bad guy. Here's a very similar warrior with a helmet that's exactly the same kind of shape and structure in this other movie. Here's Princess Leia. We got to have a princess in the other movie. She's got braids. They're not wound up around her ears. They're hanging down. So there's a difference, but there's certainly some visual similarities between the movies. But more compelling is the storyline in this other movie. Here's how this story goes in this other movie. Oh, wait, I got a couple of more visual similarities. This one is a visual similarity, except I don't have a shot of the Emperor in the first movie because he's not in the first movie. But this is the spiritual leader of the bad guys in the movie that I wanted to talk about. All right, so how does this other movie go? It starts with some poor guy out there who's actually fishing, working on nets, and he's warned that there are evils out in the world. There's one off to the east, which is not to be worried about yet, and there's one in the west that you have to worry about now, and he sort of has to contemplate what to do about it. The bad guys show up and destroy one of the cities that is nearby and do some dastardly things. They kill women and children. You see them visually throwing children into the flames and doing all kinds of horrible stuff. So you know they really are bad guys. They're knights from the west. Someone from the city that's being destroyed, a princess, has to go alert everyone else, so carry the message off to warn others that there's this super destructive force coming. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, a different city actually, we've got these two warriors. So the one on your right is the strong, silent warrior. The one on the left is the playboy, talkative, always game with the girls, etc. So you know where this is going, right? Think Chewbacca, the big, strong, silent type, and Han Solo, the playboy. And they notice some princess in that town. So this is not the same woman, this is a different woman. And they both try to flirt with her, and she's obviously not terribly interested, as you can tell. I don't know what she's got on her mind, something deeper. Meanwhile, the princess from the first city that was destroyed has come, and she's alerted everyone. There really is this danger. They have to gather their forces. She goes and gets armed to go off and fight with the men, which is what she then does. There's a big, enormous, epic, it's the word for it, battle scene. It's actually an extended set of battle scenes. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what this movie is in a minute, but I'm not recommending you watch it because it's not necessarily well made. But clearly it influenced a lot of things there. So there's this big epic battle scene, and of course in the big epic battle scene, a couple of things have to happen. One is, you can't really tell it very well here, but the playboy and the woman who is dressed in armor, who we hadn't really paid attention to before, have to fight side by side during this battle. So they're happy fighting side by side. And then of course you have to have the real thing wind up with this clash between the champions, the champion bad knight over there in white, and our hero from the good guys. So the person you saw in the very first shot when I was talking here, the poor guy that was working on his fishing nets to begin with, he has to fight and, of course, defeat the evil knight. And then the evil knight and his spiritual leader have to be brought forward and punished for the evil things they've done after they've been captured. Now, this movie ends with a little bit of happier things towards the end. So, okay, maybe I should put an asterisk on the happier things. Our two warriors, the playboy and the strong silent type, they're both badly injured in the fighting. So they're hauled back to the city where they came from, like in an ambulance, and then the princess from that city says, oh, now I'm going to pay attention to you. I'm going to give my hand to the greatest warrior here. And the question is, which of the two dying warriors is it? Is it the playboy or is it the strong silent type? She goes for the strong silent type. who may actually be dead by this time. It's hard to tell. He's that silent. But it's okay because the Playboy guy has his eye on someone else at this point, the warrior princess who's gone off and fought with him. So a little bit of differences here in the storyline, but you get kind of the same idea, right? There's this person off there who's just minding his business. There's a threat coming. He's warned. The bad guys show up. They destroy one group, one society with its women and children, everybody. Yet the princess escapes and warns others of what's coming, and then they have to fight off this, and it involves a battle, etc. So, very similar. Lucas, I'm pretty sure, saw this in film school, copied parts of it. So, the movie is a Russian movie called Alexander Nevsky. And it's an interesting story in a way because it's based on some historical things. It's based on a Russian prince who helps defeat an invasion coming from these German Teutonic Knights. Now, the guy who made this is Sergei Eisenstein, and most of you would know a little, if you know anything about film and film stories or film history at all. He made some other famous movies in the 30s, really. The Battleship Potemkin, there's some famous scenes from that have been copied by lots of people. You see later directors copying pieces as sort of an homage to his work. This movie was made in 1938. So the thing to keep in mind is Eisenstein is making this movie in the Soviet Union, right? This is really Soviet propaganda. There's a reason why this historical thing is going to be told the way it is. Part of this is because the Soviet leadership in 1937, 38, because who knows how long it took to do this epic movie in those days, they're looking at their international situation. So this is the foreign policy IR part here. They're looking at their international situation, and they know there's potential threats out there. They are worried about the Japanese in the East, and there's an allusion in the Alexander Nevsky movie to Mongol invasion coming someday, and you'll have to deal with that. But first, we've got to deal with the threat to the West. And who is this threat to the West? It's these German knights who are coming. So clearly, they're thinking about we should be preparing the population for an invasion by Nazi Germany in the near future. So nice historical parallels in some sense, right? Because they're trying to say we Russians need to be prepared to deal with the Germans who are coming, and the Germans are awful, and they're going to kill the women and children and all the rest of that stuff. They're trying to also, though, do some things that involve whipping up Russian nationalism. It's a move away from a lot of what the Soviets had been doing, the Soviet leadership had been doing in the 20s and even into the 30s, where they had been putting forward very much the sort of Marxist, this is all about class, it's about we don't care so much about nationalism, et cetera. This is a clear turn back to say, we're Russians, right? We are Russians first, and that really matters, and the Germans are sort of our longtime mortal enemies. There's also some things in here, though, about religion that cut in both directions, right? Because who is the true leader of the bad invading force here? It's this Christian bishop who's the leader of the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights are basically like crusading knights, though they are very clearly going off to try to conquer territory, right? There's real motives here that have nothing to do with religion. But in the movie, this is part of the constant setup, that it's part of, right, the dark side in this case is very clearly these crusading knights. On the other hand, part of the loosening up of the Soviet leadership, or the turn back to older values like nationalism, was also a turn back to some opening up about religion in the Soviet Union, that they knew they needed to build up support. So you would see a few things in this movie that there are a couple of scenes, and this is one, when the first town is destroyed, the mayor or leader of this town is executed, and part of the execution is they raise him up, and it's very clear they pose this against this tower where there's an angel behind him. That's not the normal thing you would have seen in a Soviet movie of the day. So, back to where I started off with. The tensions in a lot of the Star Wars movies, when you look at the politics that they're portraying, have to do with these things like, what is Luke, in this case, he's playing Alexander Nevsky. Well, so who is Alexander Nevsky? Alexander Nevsky is supposed to be, historically speaking, a prince. But the Soviets, we can't have princes saving Russia. That's not the way it works in the Soviet Union, right? So he's got to be a peasant, just like everybody else, because, that's the hero in the Soviet system. So there's tensions in how Lucas copied a lot of this story because he's borrowing the same tensions that are there in the Alexander Nevsky movie. The tensions are built in there in the sense as well that, who are the other heroes? Why do we have these princes and princesses running around saving things? We don't necessarily want to call them that, so we create something called the Force. Right? Is it hereditary? Well, we can argue back and forth on that. We'd have to bring in all the other movies. But it's very much from borrowing from these other places, from these foreign films, and following the storylines as close as he does. So that's the end of the talk. How long did it take? Not that long, see? And now we can have some questions and answers. Pardon? Okay, yeah. No one has any questions? You're all like, where did this come from? Yeah?
At the beginning, you kind of alluded to the droids and their role as slaves. If we were considering the story being told from the point of view of the lower class, wouldn't the droids then have an essential role in that as well?
So yes, right? And this is what I find interesting from, okay, so the question was, if the droids really are supposed to be part, so this thing isn't working right. If the droids are really supposed to be part of the storytelling, shouldn't the droids have a larger role in more of the movies probably, in fact? And I think this is one of those things where people pointed out the fact that the droids were being treated as underlings in the early movies, that if you tried to follow how the droids are treated over time, that's changed. As the movies have gone on, they've been treated more and more like characters rather than as sort of, the bottom servants that you treat like pieces of machinery. So, and what I was starting to say when I repeated your question was also, though, the people who think Hidden Fortress is so much of a driver of the storyline in the original movie, that means these should be really the main characters in the whole movie there, and I think it's pretty hard to argue that they are. So, somebody else? Yeah?
Well, I mean, just to add, at the same time, those are the only two characters to appear in every single Star Wars movie.
Yeah, so he pointed out that they're the only two characters to appear in all of the movies. And so, that's a very good point. I'd have to think more about telling about the whole story. I haven't even seen the last Star Wars movie, I have to confess. So, but yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer any really nerdy questions here. I'm sorry. Yeah, Mitchell.
Thinking about the Force as hereditary, because in the prequel trilogies, right?
They try to explain, right? This is a question about the Force and whether it's hereditary or not.
So, but they have sort of an academy, right, where they train young, sort of like up and coming potential knights, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in the later movies, it's sort of like whoever's left has been kind of driven underground. So I wonder if that doesn't parallel the political situation where they go from galactic senate or whatever to empire, the way that the Roman famous families were sort of hunted down one by one.
You've thought more about this than I have. So, which is, isn't necessarily saying a whole lot, I have to say too. For me, I mainly have thought about this in terms of why the first movie looks the way it does. based on earlier movies. And so I think there's definitely borrowing from lots of places, right? And so the bit about the whole shift from republic to empire, as you're pointing out, I think definitely there's some reflection back on what happened with Rome and the shift from republic to empire. Now, the families and sort of Roman history, I'm not sure Lucas spent a lot of time on that. I think what they figured out was that they told this story and there were these things in it that they then were like, oh, what is this force? We better go figure out how to explain it, right? And then they try to explain it and just get themselves into more complications. But yeah.
This is more of a personal thing than the politics. Well, I guess it is politics. But
As long as it's personal from you and not from me, that's okay.
basically, before the prequels came out, there was a perception, as I understand it, there was a perception of what the past history of this trilogy was. And for you, what would you say?
I think that's also thinking that George Lucas knew what he was doing in some massive, overarching way, which is obviously not true. And I say obviously not true just because there were various versions of the original script, right? When they committed to making the movie, it was really different than the movie they wound up making. He did several different versions, and they also have bits and pieces that you'd recognize from older stories. In Hidden Fortress, for instance, I mentioned the two servants. There's also this princess that has to be rescued. Part of the rescue party is an old general, right? So there's stuff from that was very much in the original script that Lucas wrote. And then, that got adjusted to some other set of people. And the Luke character's father was directly part of what was going on in like some version of the script, and then it went to something else. So I don't really think he had this giant, perfect. If we want to talk about Harry Potter, on the other hand, she spent a lot of time, J.K. Rowling spent a lot of time making very consistent stories and setting them up in some really consistent ways. And Lucas, I think, is winging it.
I totally agree with you. But if you were to just take the movies as themselves, it seems like there is a past history, especially with references to ancient religions. Like there's a lot of stuff there that
They're trying to do something there. I just don't know that it works a lot of the time, right? Like the stuff with the Force, and is it something you have? Is it something that's trained? Is it something you have and has to be trained? Is it, right? It's like, I just think they're trying to backfill and make some things sound much more consistent, which is great for people who want to spend a lot of time online and talk about some of these things, right? My son alerted me to the idea that Jar Jar Binks is a Darth Sith Lord, whatever, because he's in all these things. And maybe that, Lucas had that in mind. I don't know, right? But that's what happens when they try to do all this backfilling and make everything. That would require a whole different lecture, though, right?
That's like a whole week of your life.
I've seen some of the clips, so I'm like, I don't know. We have had some intense arguments about Jar Jar and what is he meant to be like, etc. Yeah?
What do you say about Star Wars that makes it so relevant today still? Like today's you still love it. And what drew you to Star Wars originally?
I went on a date, I said that. So. Luckily, this is live streaming, right? So. All right, so the question was, why does Star Wars resonate still and so forth? And I think it's for a lot of the same reasons that some of these stories keep coming back, right? Why they get retold so many times. The bit about the legend of Arthur is very much a sort of father-son relationship being developed. I think that is in lots of different stories. The notion that people have a destiny that's going to be fulfilled is one. The point, in fact, of Joseph Campbell's work, I think one of the books is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is that these stories about heroes and what they go through, and this is, okay, so one of the things is it's all very sexist, right, because it's almost always male heroes, et cetera, but is that they go through a certain set of trials and tribulations and then final victory, and it is something that you see across cultures, across time, and a lot of people who, after Joseph Campbell wrote about this stuff, use it to set up stories because it's easy to go find his outline. You can find that online too as sort of a graph about sort of what does the hero need to go through before they find redemption and victory at the end. So I think there's a lot of things like that that resonate. I do find it interesting that it has the appeal that it's had in the United States for so long. I get why this would resonate in lots of other cultures, especially ones where there is more of a sense of perhaps this hierarchy. I do find it odd that not necessarily odd, but if it was truly much more of a sort of American movie, like I said, I think it would be like the Hitchcock films where it really is your everyman pressed into the situation. You get a little bit of that feel with Han Solo maybe, but I don't know. That would make much more sense to me. Over there, yeah.
I remember reading online that originally Star Wars was supposed to be actually like Flash Gordon or something like that.
Lucas was also, I didn't say anything about Flash Gordon, but Lucas was also very much influenced by that. The notion of the sort of opening credits as a crawl the way they were, and the use of blasters and phasers and spaceships and all that. There's a lot that's from Flash Gordon. I don't know about the storyline. Did you have an idea in particular? Or?
I remember reading that there were a lot of similarities, but my question was going to be, do you think part of the problem with sort of the confusion and the politics is from George Lucas trying to adapt a story like that was already in existence, but couldn't get the rights to? Or?
No, he didn't want the rights. He had studied these things in film school and was then going to take things that he liked from those movies and put them in a different story, different setting. And clearly he borrowed from various places. And part of it was to say, we're going to tell, and this was something that had already gone back and forth with Kurosawa's movies, where he made samurai movies that were copies of American Westerns, and then Americans made Western movies that were copies of his samurai movies, right? So that sort of cultural exchange, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that, I think, goes on a lot. And often the stories do travel from one context to another pretty easily. So one of the scenes that's famous in the original Star Wars is the fight in the cantina and the arm being hacked off of whoever. That's straight from a different Kurosawa movie where there's a fight scene in a bar and the samurai does it with his sword. So there's lots of stuff like that.
If George Lucas borrowed this from
Is it plagiarism?
if he borrowed it from a Soviet movie, do you think there was anything in there at the time about existing American attitudes towards the Soviet Union?
Well, I think he's reluctant to say, like, when people interview him about his influences, he'll definitely talk about Kurosawa. I don't think he talks about
Cold War.
Alexander Nevsky's, Soviet propaganda movies' influence on him. And that, and I would understand why you wouldn't want to talk about that, because it does raise some questions about sort of what, because part of the thing in Alexander Nevsky is when the Teutonic Knights army is defeated, one of the things that then happens is they go and hack up the clerics and the bishop who's with the Teutonic Knights. So, maybe that's what should happen to the emperor, but that also gets then people thinking in the Star Wars movies that the dark side of the Force is Christianity, and he probably doesn't want to say that. So.
Just to kind of follow up on the Cold War timing, given that this came out in '77 and the United States
Yeah.
had just lost totally and hopelessly in Vietnam by '73 to '75, could it have anything to do with sort of Lucas saying, like, this is something I've always thought, the Empire being the United States and the rebels being either the North Vietnamese or just groups generally opposed to the United States around the world? No? It's just
No. Okay, so that was saying there's some kind of analogy to the Cold War period, but with it reversed in the sense that the empire is the United States. if he had made a movie at the beginning of all of these that was about the loss of a republic going to an empire, it would be much easier to say that's the U.S. is dealing with these problems, with facing an external threat and the internal ramifications to what it's doing to politics, right? Like, then I would say, yeah, I would get that connection. I don't really get that to the 1970s. I don't think any of us saw this as a, the movies that were about that kind of stuff were much more in your face. That Vietnam was, and there were plenty of those, right? There's plenty of movies about everyone that went to war in Vietnam came back damaged and unstable and unhealthy, and so I'd have to think a lot more about whether there's anything that has to do with the Cold War and this stuff. I don't think so. I think it's much more, I think he picked movies that he liked. That Lucas liked these movies, liked the visual parts especially with a bunch of them, and said, I want to embed this in some kind of traditional story that's similar to, tales that we all know. So, Eric, you had your hand up?
The Vietnam point. Because Lucas apparently in 2005, so right after Revenge of the Sith came out, essentially said that the original Star Wars was his take on Vietnam. That was sympathetic to the Vietnamese. So I was going to say, you mentioned, Lucas is kind of...
Well, it's his first big, no, it's his first big movie. I think he was like, I just want money to make a big movie. And he played around with lots of different storylines, and I don't think Vietnam is, but I'll have to think about it now. You've given me some homework. Somebody else had, yeah.
Do you have any comments on the puppet-shaped model versus modern?
No, I don't know. It definitely was impressive at the time. We were like, wow. Like I said, I had to drive to a very fancy movie theater in Beverly Hills to see this properly. And Dolby Sound was also totally new, and there were speakers, not just in front of you, but behind you. It was incredible. Yeah?
I guess the most interesting thing that you mentioned that we can actually run with, I think.
The only interesting thing that I mentioned.
No. The slave parallel, because that's pretty clear through the
Well, no, see, this I think is different. I think what's happened is over time, thinking about droids has changed. I don't think in the 70s they questioned whether droids were machinery or not. They pretty much thought, yeah, you're machinery. And now that's much more of an issue that we would be talking about. So I think if you did a study, you would find the droids being treated differently as the movies get made in time, not in the sequence, but if you go year by year and you look, I think they treat the droids differently.
You don't think there was an intentional, these are essentially sentient beings being treated as property sort of thing?
There's a bit of that, like I said, because that part of the notion of borrowing from Hidden Fortress is you have these people who are on the bottom who are telling the story, and being on the bottom is important. They have to be able to tell the story to a certain extent. They have to be characters. But I don't know that there is no theme here that the droids are going to rise up and claim I'm thinking of things in Harry Potter that we could definitely talk about where there's class structures and it's going to change, right? I don't get that in these movies. You had another question? Yes? No? Did you have another question?
Yeah, my question was, did your date enjoy this movie?
Yes. She did. It was not the last date we had. It was the beginning of many dates. We're now in the too much information part of the talk. How about a different kind of question? Any other questions anyone's got? Or discussion points, or, yeah? Well, no, I think if we want to do more of these, the PSSA next year needs to do that. There's definitely, I have thought at times of how you would create IR courses around movies because there's a lot of IR concepts embedded in a number of movies, sometimes really blatantly embedded, but often not. And it would be an interesting way to try to organize a course about IR theory. But there's definitely tons of stuff in the Harry Potter stories, and therefore also in the movies, but definitely in the books, that have a lot to do with politics and historical influences and all the rest, and probably a lot more than you would realize. So I did once go a long time ago, when like the second or third Harry Potter movie came out. I did talk to Nancy Wood. She was running the noon hour talk show on CBC Radio at that point. And I and another person talked about the Harry Potter stories with an emphasis on the politics in them and the stuff. So I'd be happy to come back and talk about it. I'd have to do my homework, but I'm not ready to do that yet. So yeah.
A lot of people that make parallels to the expanded power that the Palpatine gets in the prequels to the Bush administration or any other 14 presidents. Do you think there's something to that?
There's definitely notions about you create the external threat in order to concentrate power, right? Like that's an old idea, and definitely you could probably draw some parallels there. I'm not sure that I remember enough of those movies off the top of my head to say that that's that convincing, but it's a old story. And that's part of the story of what happened to Athens and Rome both, right? They go from being republics to being empires because they're in international conflict. So someone needs to make that as a course. You could probably find, Professor Brynan would probably come and talk about that. Yeah.
How adaptable do you think those IR theories are to the Star Wars? Because especially in the...
Usually these are stretches, right? You're talking about IR theory, bringing IR theory into these things. If you note, that's not quite what I did.
I was just a general...
So I don't know about Star Wars and taking... Oh, there's stuff, and this is the problem, is they did not set out. This is why I don't think I would believe the bits about Lucas was trying to make a political point about anything. I think he borrowed, and the politics gets pulled in this non-thinking way, which creates problems that he then has to try to resolve by changing and making up this other stuff in the prequels. There are plenty of movies. It doesn't mean that you couldn't look and say, okay, I see a certain kind of political structure or political discussion, and we could talk about it. I just don't think you're going to find a lot of consistent logic there. Again, different with the Harry Potter stories, where J.K. Rowling had this very long, drawn-out development of the story and the plot line and everything else. So I think she had some very clear ideas and political points definitely in mind when she did that. There are a number of movies where either it's about wars starting, or it's about nuclear threat, or it's about whatever, and clearly IR theory is part of what's embedded in it. But there are also plenty of times where stories have that as sort of a background, and it's not up front and center, and it's not the key point the person's trying to make, but the politics is there in the background. If you understand the concepts and theories from IR, you would see how that's driving things along. So I don't know that I could actually make a course like that, but 13-week course, I don't know. Students have written on course evaluations that I need to show more movies. So. Yeah.
Are they slaves or are they like sentient beings? This is a series where the good guys had no compulsions, but these are a clone army to fight their war against like the victims.
Yeah, and I don't know where, the clone army story is probably something that came from Flash Gordon. I don't even know, but yeah. No, I don't think I think he's trying to tell good stories, right? And make good movies. I don't think he was trying to make any big political stories. I think once you get the power and you're making these movies, then yeah. And if you note, one of the things that happens is he borrows from Alexander Nevsky. The bad guys are symbolic of the Nazis. So, what do we see in other sets of movies that Lucas and Spielberg make? We just use the Nazis. Everyone agrees they're the bad guys. No one cares when they lose or they get killed, right? Nazi zombies. Now we have to go over the top, yeah. Now it's being a Nazi means, okay, but Nazi zombies we can destroy completely, so, yeah. Yeah.
I think, because I know there's been some writing about trying to assess like the Empire's coin doctrine, fighting a rebellion. I was wondering if you heard
I've
that.
never seen any of that, no. The question had to do with the Empire's counterinsurgency strategies and people analyzing those, why they keep losing to the, yeah, no, I don't, no. Did you have a question? No? No? All right, one more, go ahead.
This question is slightly branching off something you said about how politics can be movies, and you kind of see it in the original series and then kind of being in the prequels. And so my question is, what would be your reading where a lot of movies now we have kind of had the heroes be kind of defecting from the side that they're originally presented as being, like in Star Wars there's a character who like leaves the First Order, in Avatar the character leaves humans to join the Na'vi or whatever. So what do you think it says about politics if we're more and more starting to make heroes when the characters defect from the original side?
I don't know. I don't know about that. I do, you mentioned Avatar, and we could definitely talk about what was borrowed and put into that from other movies. And then we'd have to talk about Disney, because there's tons borrowed from some Disney stories there. I would have to think about those stories and where the heroes come from a bit more. Because I'm not sure that I see those as the same. I'm not sure that I agree with your point of comparison. But I'd have to think about that too. So. All right, I think we're done, aren't we? Thank you guys, and hopefully you'll have some stuff to argue amongst yourselves with now.